So as we sit around the campfire, you might notice your state of consciousness shifts. If you're listening to a story, if you close your eyes, if you meditate, if you're fasting, all of these things are different tricks and techniques for shifting our state of consciousness, dropping out of a fast frequency of active thinking into a lower, more relaxed, more receptive frequency where we can attune to things that move a little bit slower. And sometimes in these other states of consciousness, we get access to information that we might not have otherwise. In 1893, Hans Berger was in a cavalry training exercise, and he got thrown from his horse just as a horse-drawn cannon was galloping towards him, and he thought for certain he was at death's door. In that same moment, miles away in a completely different town, his sister had a sudden feeling of fear for him, feeling that he was in mortal danger, and she convinced her father to telegraph him immediately. Luckily, the horse-drawn cannon was able to stop, and Berger was unharmed. When he received the telegram, he was baffled by how his sister could have known what he was going through, being many miles away. What could have connected them across that distance? It drove him to research the issue. Radios were just coming into prominence, so there was this idea that electromagnetism could somehow carry information across vast distances and could be tuned into and downloaded. Maybe something like that was going on between his sister and him. Berger went on to get his medical degree in psychiatry and began researching links between physiological activity and subjective experience, including brain pulsations, temperature, medications, and other physiological markers. His experiments with brain pulsations, the electrical activity in the brain, did not meet with much success until 1924, when he was able to sufficiently amplify the signal to get the first successful electroencephalogram or EEG measurement. So this was 1924, almost a full 30 years after his accident, and he was just over 50 at the time. He worked on this for 5 more years before he even published his result. As someone who was willing to lecture on topics such as telepathy, Berger was not unaccustomed to people's critiques of his work. So he wanted to make sure he had something solid before he put it out to the public. Initially, his research was met with derision and largely ignored until 1934, when 2 other researchers were able to reproduce his results. It was 1937 before psychiatric practices in the UK, US, and France began utilizing his EEG in their work. But who was Berger that he would be willing to entertain these fringe ideas and work so tirelessly to try to figure out their physiological basis? He and his sister both grew up near the asylum when his father was a doctor. And so they were probably pretty well versed in the various different states of consciousness that humans could experience and the different ways that showed up in their behavior. In addition, their mother's father was a poet and professor of Oriental language who spoke 30 languages. And this quote here is from him. "Of what each one should be, he sees the form and rule. Until he reach that, his joy cannot be full." I would say Berger did a pretty good job of manifesting his grandfather's dictum there, following his curiosity until its fulfillment. Berger was finally honored for his work by the Congress of Psychology's 1937 symposium, and with tears in his eyes, he said, "In Germany, I am not so famous." And this time, the Nazis were coming to power. They suspended his research, prevented his travel to the U.S. to teach, and prevented his acceptance of a Nobel Prize nomination. After a long period of depression, severe skin infection, Berger hung himself in 1941 at age 68. Had he survived the war, he likely would have won a Nobel Prize. While Berger only glimpsed the tiniest sliver of his work's success, his commitment and efforts live on in the continued application of his invention, of which we are now the beneficiaries of, getting to use this tool to see the correlations between the electromagnetic activity of the brain and our subjective states of consciousness. While Berger may not have succeeded in identifying the mechanism for telepathic connection, the EEG did very successfully correlate electrical activity in the brain with subjective states of consciousness. Now we recognize several brainwave states as they correlate with different states of consciousness: deep sleep, delta waves, theta waves of dreams and hypnagogic sleep transition, alpha waves whenever you close your eyes or meditate or watch TV, hear stories, and beta waves of active thinking. Gamma waves are the most recently discovered and least thoroughly understood. They're the highest frequency brainwave state and seem to play a role in unifying subjective experience, bringing together different parts of the brain to contribute to a single experience. So the ability to measure, have a quantifiable measurement that correlates with these distinct subjective states of consciousness, gives us a clue into the various experiences of time of those states of consciousness. In deep sleep, we experience no time. That's a delta wave state, between 1 and 4 beats per second. That's a bump, 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 bump. Here is about synchronized with your heartbeat, about 60 beats per minute. Theta brainwave state, this is shamanic drum beat. 5 to 7 beats per second. A driving brainwave state, a driving beat. It's used to entrain people into a state of dreamlike active imagination. Alpha is a little bit faster than that, and beta is a little bit faster than that. And these are also evident in a developmental phase. So we experience them all over the course of a day between our sleep and wake cycle. And babies are predominantly in delta brainwave state, similar to the deep sleep we experience as adults. Young children between ages 2 and 6 are predominantly in a theta brainwave state, so a magical dreamlike state of consciousness where they have not yet learned linear causal time. Yesterday and tomorrow might be the same thing. Remembering and imagination might not be that different from one another. They might even conflate their identity with somebody else and remember a sibling's memory or something like that. Time is very slippery and has to be indoctrinated into us all as young people. Theta also represents the time of dreams. Perhaps you've had a dream that has played out one way and then you thought, no, actually I don't want to have it play out that way, and you went back in time in the dream and played it out another way. So there's this flexible temporality that happens in the theta brainwave state also. There's also this sense sometimes that when you wake up from a dream, the dream is there in its entirety, and it might seem, or at least sometimes it seems to me, like the reconstruction of the linearity of the dream actually happens in my waking state of consciousness, and that the dream itself might not have been that distributed in time. It was more of a present moment complete thing in and of itself. And it was only the imposition of the waking state of consciousness that teased it out into a linear storyline. In the alpha brainwave state, time also has a different flavor. It's emerging into the active thinking, linear, objectified time from this very fluid, very present moment, dreamlike time. Theta brainwave states are purely present moment. Their relationship to the past and future is quite nebulous. Whereas in the alpha state, think about the difference between active thinking and then closing your eyes, resting. It's like you're approaching that timeless, fully present moment of theta. It's a state that helps us integrate between the two, between the present and the expanse of time. With our eyes closed, we might replay activities from the day or our dreams or imagine certain futures. And so it's a place not of hard and fast rules of time, but of playing with time in a malleable way, of feeling into the future, of remembering the past, of creating stories of meaning that connect narratives. And then with the open eyes and alert thinking of the beta brainwave state, that's where we get the objective clock time, where we have to keep schedules and check our email and make sure we're places on time, and all of these things that dominate our adult modern lives that we tend to think of as the reality of time, neglecting all of these other softer states of consciousness and their associated temporalities, which are very different. Because we don't know so much about gamma, we can't necessarily identify it with a particular state of time, but we're going to go ahead and line these EEG states up with Gebser's structures of consciousness, and that might help shed a little bit of light, because he specifically discusses the temporality of each of these structures. Adding Gebser's structures of consciousness to our EEG chart here on the left, and his notion of the dimensionality of space-time that goes along with each of these structures. The archaic being a zero-dimensional structure, non-differentiated, like the void of deep sleep, of no self, of the delta brainwave state. The magical structure being one-dimensional, purely present, purely here and now, has a synchronistic temporality, so it's about what wants to happen together rather than what causes something in a linear succession through time. It's about the mutual co-arising, and therefore there being a meaningful relationship between those things that happen together. In the mythic structure of consciousness, the temporality is cyclic. And so you can think about the story of a myth and the arc of that story traversing the arc of something that might be happening in one's own life, or going along with the seasons and teaching us something about the cycles of nature. In this way, there's a two-dimensionality that emerges. There's a here and now, and there's a once upon a time. There's the mythic realm, the divine realm, as separate from the concrete, immanent realm, but still connected by virtue of these themes, by virtue of the archetypes that inhabit that mythic realm, then infuse meaning and hints of what might be coming next and what might be coming around again in the cyclic nature of things. And this relates to the alpha EEG state of that closed eyes, reflective thinking state. Then we have the mental structure of consciousness, which for Gebser was epitomized in the art of the time, of that dimensionality which came through by the use of the vanishing point in art, so that all of a sudden you could see 3 dimensions fully present in a 2-dimensional art piece. Whereas previously, with the mythic structure of consciousness, we had, like, if you think about the rugs from the Middle Ages with the unicorns and stuff like that, there's a 2-dimensionality, a flatness to it. Or Mayan or Egyptian hieroglyphics, all of these 2-dimensional imageries had not quite erupted into that 3rd dimension yet. So this perspective, this inviting in of the 3rd dimension, allows for the objectification and the quantization of time. Clock time is what fits specifically into the mental structure of consciousness as linear and causal. Classical mechanics fits specifically in here. The notion of the universe is a billiard ball universe where if we know exactly where this particle is going and how fast and how much it weighs, and we'll know exactly how it's going to hit the next particle and where it's going to be going because we know exactly how much it weighs. So if we have all of these things determined, we can determine every action in the universe. Obviously, this aligns with the beta structure or brainwave state of consciousness, which is alert, active, focused thinking, goal-oriented thinking. And the integral structure of consciousness is more about, we have a 4-dimensionality that arrives here, and the 4th dimension being a subjective dimension of time for Gebser. And what that allows is the transparency between all of these previous structures of consciousness, the allowing of each one to have its realm of authority and reality, and not just to be purely denigrated by the one that comes after it, so that second one can come to its fruition. With the integral, this transparency across all of the structures allows them to coexist and mutually reinforce one another. What this means for an EEG correlate isn't exactly clear. Is gamma specifically the best correlate for this position? I don't know that it is. I think perhaps it might be the fractal relationship between each of the brainwave states, the way they nest within each other. That is the signature of the integral. And it's fascinating because that fractal relationship between brainwave states is always present. It's already there. It's not an above and beyond thing to add on. And I kind of like this element of it because it's a recognition of something that is already there, kind of in the tradition of the Zen koan. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Same thing, different perspective. One of the beautiful things about being able to bring EEG states and Gebser structures of consciousness into dialogue is the way they nest within one another. So EEG already contains this natural temporal nesting in that we go through these cycles of EEG states with every sleep cycle we're in, really. That happens several times a night where we go from deep sleep to dreaming to awake to dreaming to deep sleep to awake. And so we have this on a very short time cycle, and we also have the cycle happening on a larger lifetime scale. From babyhood to adulthood, we're moving from delta to beta, starting with that long, slow frequency and slowly layering in faster and faster frequencies as we age. And so by adding Gebser structures of consciousness here, we add a whole other level of scale to the same pattern that's being played out in a couple different ways. So now the level of scale is an evolution of consciousness level of scale. It is reasonable to wonder what influence Berger's EEG and Gebser's structures of consciousness might have had on the other model. Looking at the historical context of each of these systems, we can see that Berger, there in the left column, was born nearly 60 years before Gebser. His first EEG measurements was in 1924, which he didn't publish until 29, wasn't corroborated until 34, and then was starting to gain wider practice in 1937, which we can see Gebser was in Paris at that time, where psychological practices were beginning to use EEG. So it is certainly possible that Gebser did encounter this technology, because the history of science was something that he definitely took into consideration in developing his structures of consciousness. The original idea for his structures of consciousness came in 1931 when he was traveling Rilke's path through Spain and was in a town just layered with history, and felt profoundly this transition point that humanity was in between the mental and the integral, as artists were trying to start expressing the subjective nature of time. Like in Picasso's Cubism, we shifted from the mythical structures, two-dimensional imagery, to the mental structures, perspectival imagery with the vanishing point. And then Picasso shows up and he's trying to show an object from every viewpoint of that object on one flat two-dimensional piece of paper. And so there's this sense in which you can walk around an object and see it from every viewpoint that he's trying to embed into the reality. And Rilke, similarly, was extending the self to encompass the world. And so all of these things were playing in Gebser's consciousness as he started formulating the structures of consciousness that came to him in the flash of insight. But of course, he didn't publish The Ever-Present Origin until 1949. One would suspect, however, because he does mention many scientific theories in his book, that had he known or consciously drawn from EEG, he certainly would have mentioned it. EEG brainwave states, we didn't know about all of them immediately. They're actually named in the order of their discovery. And so the alpha brainwave state, the first letter of the Greek alphabet, being the first brainwave state that was discovered. Just upon closing the eyes, that alpha brainwave state pops out. Next brainwave state was the beta, open eyes, active thinking beta waves. Then theta waves, that dreamlike sleep transition stage. Then delta, the brainwaves of deep sleep. And then gamma didn't come till much later, when we actually had improved the technology considerably to refine and be able to detect a higher frequency. And in fact, there's overlap between the frequency of our musculature and the frequency of gamma waves. And so there have been studies showing that what is detected as gamma waves might actually be muscle working in the scalp. And so it's hard to differentiate those two things. Okay, so we see there is an overlap. Gebser was certainly in the field. He was hanging out with Jung, who obviously would have known about EEG. So it could have been in his circles. It could have influenced him by being in the background. Or maybe he didn't know about it at all, and he just happened to delineate similar states that were delineated by the electromagnetic states of the brain. To dig a little bit deeper into waves and frequencies, we need a little bit of a basic terminology to start with. So here are our wave basics. So if you just start up at the top left over there, and you can see the basic anatomy of a wave, with its trough at the low point, the crest, its high point, and the amplitude being the distance from that vertical midline up to the top of the crest or down to the bottom of the trough. They're both going to be the same height in a standard wave, and those both characterize the amplitude. So how much is that wave varying from that midline of the vertical? The wavelength is the distance between the nodal points. So the first time it departs from the center and goes down to the trough, covers a trough and a crest, and then comes back to that center point. That is the definition of a wavelength. So it can have both a spatial definition, if the wave is propagating through space, like a sound wave, or an electromagnetic wave, like light or a radio wave. Or it can have a temporal definition if it's just a frequency of activity. So like something that's a beat that's happening, the wavelength might be half a second long between snaps instead of it being a wave that's propagating through space. So in this one right below here, you can see how waves can nest together. So we see that our initial wave there is labeled as A, and then there's a secondary wave layered on top of it labeled as B. And that's covering two wavelengths, because you can see there's a trough and a crest, and then another trough and another crest. So there's two waves of B nestled in with the one wave of A. And this is a octave relationship. So anytime there's a doubling or a halving relationship, so A is double the wavelength of B and half the frequency of B. B is half the wavelength of A and double the frequency of A. So wavelength and frequency is another terminology to pay attention to, because these are inversely proportional. And so the wavelength is going to be 1 divided by the frequency, or vice versa. So here, if we say the wavelength of A is 1, the wavelength of B would be 1/2, because it's half the wavelength of 1. So I know it says 2 wavelengths down at the bottom, and that's going to show us actually what the frequency is, because if the wavelength is half, 1/2, then the frequency is going to be the inverse of that, which is 2, or 2 beats per second, or 2 beats per wavelength of wave A. So you can see here how half the wavelength equals double the frequency. And so there's always going to be this inverse relationship between wavelength and frequency. Okay, the next concept in this middle image that we're going to look at is interference. And so in that first column, we have two waves, and we're adding them together, and their troughs are lined up and their crests are lined up, meaning they are in phase with one another. And so when we add two waves together that are in phase with one another, then it's called constructive interference. So their troughs double in depth and their crests double in height. So that amplitude is doubling in both directions. It's a constructive interference. The wave gets more powerful, bigger, increases in its intensity. Whereas if we move to the next column over, where we have those two waves being added together, but here the trough is lining up with the crest, and the crest is lining up with the trough, what it equals is a flat line. So here we have destructive interference, where the crest and the trough cancel each other out in both points, and what you're left with is a still point. And so this final image here on the right-hand side shows us a whole collection of waves, and they're colored according to their wavelength, because longer, slower waves tend to be redder according to the visible spectrum of light. So that's actually how we refer to all waves, whether they're visible or not. We say they're redder if they're longer or slower, or bluer if they're shorter and faster. And so if we add up all of these waves and how they would interfere, where their crests cross and their troughs cross, we have constructive interference. And where their crests and troughs line up, we have destructive interference. And so the final waveform of the sum of all these waves together is going to look like something totally different than any one of the waves individually. And so you can think about this as playing a guitar chord, where you're playing 6 strings. Each string is a different note, a different frequency of sound. But when you play them together, you hear it as one sound, the sound of that chord. And so that wave in black on the right would be the sound of the chord, and all those colors would be the sound of the different notes that make up that chord. And we have a mathematical transformation that allows us to translate from an entire wave into its constituent parts, the frequencies of its individual waves, and it's called the Fourier Transform. So the Fourier transform you can see here, you can see that entire wave in the left-hand image as the red wave. And you can see in that same image on the left, there's another panel angling off to the right that's just a blue line and has some little vertical blue lines coming up from it. So this is translating between that red line, that wave is playing out in time. The horizontal axis is in time. But the panel with the blue line on it is the frequency spectrum. And so each of those vertical lines is denoting a wave of a different frequency. And the height of each vertical line is denoting the amplitude of that wave. So you can see those wave components kind of in the background there between these two, which show what we're translating between that long, slow, tall wave of the lowest frequency, and then as the wavelengths get shorter and faster, their amplitudes decrease. And this is a typical signature for any frequency relationship in nature, that the long, slow waves are typically more powerful, have a higher amplitude than the short, fast waves. And it's also true in our brainwave. So in the right-hand side here, you can see a raw EEG signal, which is pretty chaotic and would be hard to discern what the brainwave components are, because while we talk about brainwave states as if there's just one happening at a time, they're actually all happening at the same time. And one might just be highlighted or come into dominance in a particular subjective state. And so we start with a raw EEG signal, and then we can analyze that using the Fourier transform, and it can give us out these component waves, the delta waves, the theta wave, the alpha wave, the beta wave, and the gamma wave that all add up to that raw EEG signal. And then these component waves we can display on a frequency spectrum down here, where you can see that orange is correlating with the delta, the pink with the theta, the red with the alpha, and the green with the beta, and blue with the gamma waves. And so this can show you which waveform is dominant. Here, the delta waves in orange are not the highest in amplitude, which is just because they've performed a mathematical adjustment to this graph to highlight other things, which is often the case. But in general, your delta brainwave states do have the highest amplitude. And so the analogy here is like the bass line in a band is going to be the loudest, that drum beat, the driving rhythm that is going to hold the structure for the rest of the band. It's melodies to dance within, right? So that longest, slowest frequency is typically the loudest, has the highest amplitude or intensity, and then the shorter, faster frequencies tend to have lower amplitudes or intensities. And like I said, this is a pattern that shows up in many frequency relationships in nature. Another interesting thing to point out here that will show up again in this course is that the time to frequency relationship here, so moving a waveform from the time domain into the frequency domain to see its frequency or power spectrum. When we can use the Fourier transform to get between these two realms are referred to as Fourier duals. And this relationship shows up elsewhere. They're also called conjugate variables. And so time and frequency are conjugate variables. Time and energy are also conjugate variables as they show up in the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, just like momentum and position are conjugate variables as they show up in the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. This is because one of the variables is a derivative of the other, and that just means it's telling us how the other one is changing. And so we have the wave that plays out in time, and the frequency spectrums are telling us how that waveform is changing in time. So the wider range of time we have to sample a raw wave, the more specific we can get about what frequencies add up to that wave. If we just have a very short sample from that wave, there's going to be more uncertainty as to the frequencies that make it up. And so if we know the frequencies very exactly, chances are that the amount of time of the wave we have is a larger amount of time. And if we have a very small slice of time, then there's going to be more uncertainty in our frequencies. And so with the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, with position and momentum, position is the initial variable. Momentum is equal to the mass times the velocity. Well, the mass isn't changing, but the velocity is telling you how the position is changing. So it's the derivative of position. So same idea. If we know the position exactly, there's more uncertainty as to how that position is changing. It could be going in any direction if we're just looking at it at one moment in time, in one specific location. Whereas if we have a wider range of where the position has been, then we can know how that position is changing more exactly, and vice versa. If we know the velocity very exactly, then there's going to be a certain amount of uncertainty as to exactly where the particle is along that velocity trajectory. And so this will come up again when we look at Heisenberg uncertainty principle, but it's just a fascinating thing that there's this connection of the Fourier transform of any variable and its derivative, that there's this uncertainty relationship built in, that if you know one very exactly, there's going to be a little uncertainty in the other. You need to have a broader range for that variable in order for that relationship to hold. In this image on the right, you can see the normal shape of that graph in yellow, with the delta waves as the highest, and then cruising on down out to the gamma waves on the end there. And it's also showing the distinction of, so the yellow is happening when your eyes are open, so alpha is being blocked, they're saying here. When you close your eyes, that gray spike in the alpha range shoots up, and that's how we identify an alpha dominant state. It's also illustrated here on the left, and the alpha is highlighted in yellow. Here we can see the nesting of the brainwave states within each other in this harmonic octave relationship. You look at the graph on the left and notice that the vertical axis here is frequency now, measured in hertz, which is the same as beats per second. In our previous graphs, frequency was along the bottom. Now it's along the vertical axis. And so that uppermost measure here, that red 40 and the little Greek symbol in red next to it, is gamma. So this is the midpoint of the gamma brain waves there at 40 hertz or beats per second. And then swoop on down to that next point, beta, brain waves with a midpoint of 20 hertz. And then down to alpha with a midpoint of 10 hertz, theta at 5 hertz, and delta at 2.5 hertz. So you can see here that there's this doubling relationship happening. 2.5 is the midpoint of delta, doubles to 5 of theta, which doubles to 10 of alpha, which doubles to 20 of beta, etc. And so there's this octave relationship between these brainwave states. And if we continue over to the chart on the right, we can see that it continues to even slower frequencies. Now that vertical line is still frequency, but its highest measure is now 1.6 hertz instead of 50 hertz. So 50 hertz being 50 beats per second, so a very finely grained frequency. Whereas 1.6 hertz is 1.6 beats per second. So it's just a little bit faster than 1 beat per second. And so here we see heart rate has, they're assigning heart rate average value of about 75 beats per minute. So just a little over 1 beat per second, which would be 60 beats per minute. And that's a 1.25 hertz. Then swooping on down, these other points are different breath rates to be working with. And where it says HRV at the intersection of those red arrows, that's referring to the heart rate variability. So how much is your heart rate varying between the high frequency, that top red line, the center frequency, and the low frequency, that bottom line. And your heart rate variability, you can test yourself. So just go ahead and find your pulse on your wrist. And then once you have that, let's just take a few slow breaths together. And what I want you to pay attention to is the rate of your pulse and how it might differ from inhale to exhale. Okay? So let's go ahead and inhale and exhale. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. And maybe you were able to notice that typically the pulse will accelerate on inhalation and slow down on exhalation. It's called a sinus arrhythmia and can be an indicator of heart health and recovery time and vagal tone. But it's also just an indication of how your breath rate and your heart rate are nesting together and relating to one another. So those two frequencies that live deeply within your body are intimately intertwined. The HeartMath Institute has a great meditation that goes along with this. In fact, I learned it from a biofeedback game they had in the early 2000s called Journey to the Wild Divine. It would measure your heart rate variability and skin conductance, and it would give you different tests like blowing a pinwheel, and as you blew, the pinwheel on the screen would spin, or aiming an arrow, or having to decrease your energy or elevate your energy. But one of the indicators it had was like a flashing jewel that would correspond to your heartbeat. And eventually I figured out the best way to center myself to shoot an arrow for this one particular challenge on the game was to sync up my breathing with my heart rate. So instead of counting my breaths in seconds, to count them in pulses. And so to inhale for 5 pulses and exhale for 5 pulses. You can just try that now. Find your pulse on your wrist again. And I won't count out because everyone's pulse will be different, but let's just take a minute, or just, y'all go ahead and pause the video and try it for a second, and then come back once you've done it and see if it's affected your state. And so this naturally extends your exhalation time because of the built-in sinus arrhythmia. So it's a little bit of feedback happening there that naturally slows your breathing down and calms your energy. The HeartMath Institute has also found it also increases your heart rate variability through this little feedback mechanism. The other way to do this, however, because counting has been found to be a little harder to sustain for long periods of time, is simply to bring to mind an experience of love and to really concentrate on that feeling of love, and that also raises one's heart rate variability. So if you had a hard time detecting much sinus arrhythmia, much difference in your pulse rate between inhalation and exhalation, maybe you could try doing this meditation on love for a few minutes and then try measuring your pulse rate again and seeing if that sinus arrhythmia maybe shows up a little more pronounced. Very fun biofeedback games to play. We're all coming back to these nested frequencies within us. And when we can sync up 2 of these frequencies, it has repercussions all the way along, because you know if you're calming or raising your heart rate variability by calming your body, you know that's having an effect on your brain, and vice versa. And so the relationship between these nested brainwave states, which are nested in our heart rate, which are nested in our breath rate, are all very tied together. So here's another way to look at the same data. I just took the frequency here in the left-hand column and just doubled it, starting it with a low rate for the breath, and then a blink rate, and then a heart rate, and then delta, theta, alpha, beta, all the brainwave states. And then I layered it into, because they naturally emerge in the frequency doubling. So the frequencies double up to 1, and at the heart rate is about 1 beat per second, is 60 beats per minute with the heart rate. Delta is a midpoint of about 2 beats per second. Theta 4, alpha 8, beta 16. And so at this 16 hertz, you'll see there's a beta slash C0. And at 32 hertz, there's a gamma slash C1. So these are the octaves of the musical note C. So the very low notes start hitting a similar frequency of our brainwave state. These are different types of wave. Our brains are electromagnetic waves, sound waves are actual vibrations of molecules. And so they're not interacting in the same way. They're two different forms, wave forms, but they overlap in frequency here. And you can see this octave relationship. So with each octave of that C note, there's a doubling to the next frequency. And then if we scoot on up even further, then we get to the propagating electromagnetic spectrum with AM radio waves and FM radio waves, and eventually we'd get up to visible light and UV rays. And so here, again, you can see that relationship between frequency and wavelength as inverse proportional. So go up to the very top row with the breath, and there's a frequency of 0.125 hertz. And so just that much of a wave happens over the course of a second. And so how many seconds does it take the whole wave to take? It takes 8 seconds. For a blink, which happens at a rate of 0.25 hertz, it takes 4 seconds between blinks for just an average. And so here I've measured the wavelength in time because these waves they're not going anywhere. It's just an event that's happening at the same place. Whereas when you get it down into the notes, the musical notes, those wavelengths, the sound is propagating out. So it has a wavelength in meters or centimeters based on this last column over here is telling you the speed of the wave, which is the speed of sound. And when you get into AM and FM radio waves, those are electromagnetic waves, which all travel at the speed of light. And so there have the speed of the wave is the speed of light, whereas brain waves are happening in the same place, so they don't necessarily have a speed covered because they're not propagating across a distance. They're more like a standing wave, just demarcating a frequency in time happening in the same place. When we think about time as a tension between frequencies, two of the main frequencies that we have to look at as far as heavenly bodies go are our own path around the sun and those of the planets. So since Venus is so close to us in her orbital period, the rhythms of her orbital period interaction with the Earth's orbital period interaction can actually count out quite long periods of time because it takes these two frequencies a while to resolve themselves again. It takes a very high number to be a common multiple of Venus's orbital cycle and Earth's orbital cycle. Venus's orbital cycle is 225 days and compared to Earth's 365. So their least common multiple is 2,921 days, which is about 8 Earth years. It's also 13 Venus years, or 5 synodic cycles, or morning star rises. And if you're watching these morning star rises from Earth, you will see that each morning star rise is in a different position against the fixed background of stars, such that after 5 morning star rises, the 6th morning star rise will happen very close to that first morning star rise again. So there's a pentagram traced out in the sky with the points of the pentagram at each of the morning star rises. The Venus appears as the morning star for 263 days, and then goes behind the sun in her underworld journey for 50 to 60 days before rising as the evening star and staying up there for 263 days again, another 9 months, before coming in front of the sun and swinging very quickly between 3 and 16 days, and then she returns to her morning star position. So this cycle between morning star rises is a synodic cycle. It's 584 days, which is very close to the sum of a Venus and an Earth cycle, but not exactly. So here is the pentagram that Venus traces out against the background of fixed stars. Each star shape is 5 synodic cycles, or 5 morning star rises, or 8 years. And so every 8 years, Venus rises in the same sign again, but shifted 2 to 3 degrees from her last rise in that sign. This is where the very long cycles of time come about. It takes 1,215 years for Venus to return to the exact same spot, to rise as the morning star in the same spot as she did 1,215 years prior. The Mayan calendar is built out of similar interlocking cycles of time. The Hob calendar traces out 360 days plus an extra 5 days, traces the year of the Earth, and is also known as the secular calendar, whereas the sacred calendar, or the Tzolk'in calendar, is a 260-day calendar. Interestingly, very similar to the 263-day period in which Venus is the morning star and the 263-day period in which Venus is the evening star. Of course, those periods are interspersed by the superior and inferior conjunctions of Venus, which take between 5 and 60 days, and so those wouldn't necessarily be counted into the calendar in the same way. But as we can see here with these gears on the left labeled number 2 and number 3, there's a circle of 20 name days combined with 13 number days, and that 20 times 13 is what gives a total of 260 to get all the 260 days of the sacred calendar. And when we combine these 2 calendars over here in this little chart, we have the secular calendar on the far right, the sacred calendar next to that, and I've also included the synodic cycles there. And then on the far left, we have numbers of days. And so you can see 260 days, that's one cycle of the sacred calendar, and not an even cycle of the synodic cycle or the secular calendar. 365 days is one cycle of the secular calendar, not even for the synodic or sacred calendar. And 584 is one cycle of the synodic cycle of the between morning star rises. Once again, not even for the sacred or secular calendar. Then we have that 2,920-day cycle where the synodic cycle and the secular calendar line up, and that's every 8 Earth years. but doesn't quite match up for the sacred calendar. In order to get the sacred calendar to match up, we have to wait 104 Earth years. Then we will get evenly fit in 146 sacred calendar cycles and 65 synodic calendar cycles. So that right there is a magical time period when all three of those cycles line up so nicely. Even that largest time period of Venus returning to the exact same spot against the fixed background of stars for her morning star rise every 1,216 years is an even number for synodic cycles, and while not quite an even number for the sacred calendar, is pretty darn close to an even number. So we might just count it. This is all just to say these different ways of counting time with interlocking cycles of time, tensions between frequencies. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to your reflections in the discussion.